Good evening from Bangkok, Thailand. My name is Sreehari Bodhi, and I'll be your host for this sessions today. And welcome you all to the fourth meeting of Equitable Education Alliance. And the theme for the fourth meeting, which is a very special meeting again today, is the theme of economic, livelihood, and social impact of equitable education. And we have the partners who are joining here today of all the Alliance. And within 1 hour that we will have you with us here today from all over the world. We are very happy to have a very fruitful 1 hour. I'm sure your hour will be very productive because we have a very interesting speakers to share with you their experience. Let me quickly go over the agenda for you, so you know that what we will have in the 1 hour session that going to be very fruitful. First, we will have a welcome remark by Dr. Krayot Patrawat. He's the Managing Director of the Equitable Education Fund of Thailand, who is one of the partners initiating this alliance. And then the stars of tonight is the sessions on the impact of equitable choices in education. And we will hear from the perspective of 3 distinguished speakers. And after the sessions on the impact of equitable choices in education, we will have another interesting session of what is Equitable Education Alliance and how will you can join and how you can benefit or learning from it. And then we will have the closing remark from our host for tonight. So I can see that we have lots of participants joining. And by the way, you will have a Q&A sessions. You can type your question in the chat box, and we have the team who will prepare the questions, and we will respond to you and link to the speakers. So I'd like to start our evening today, our fourth meeting on the Equitable Education Alliance with the welcome remark from Dr. Krayot Patrawat, the Managing Director of the EEF, or the Equitable Education Fund.
Good afternoon from Bangkok. Good evening and good morning from our colleagues from different parts of the world. On behalf of the organizing agencies, my name is Krayot Patrawat, Managing Director of the Equitable Education Fund, or EEF, from Thailand. I would like to sincerely welcome everyone to this Equitable Education Alliance meeting on economics, livelihood, and social impacts of equitable education. EEF and UNESCO Asia Pacific Regional Bureau for Education deeply appreciate your attendance in the meeting today. The Equitable Education Alliance was established in 2020 to build a community of organizations who are committed to improve education equity across the world. In order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 4 in 2030, the Alliance aims to facilitate knowledge sharing and provide technical support and recommendations to the network partners in order to strengthen equitable education models in each organization country. As part of the founding organization, EEF would like to promote EEA as a continuing effort of our international partners, especially the UNESCO, who has been instrumental in helping Thailand setting up the Equitable Education Fund as the independent public fund dedicated for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged children, school and equitable education policy movement in Thailand and beyond. Although the effort has been taken to reach SDG 4, the COVID-19 pandemic has posed tremendous challenge on education system and everyone around the world. Distance learning that was established as options for many governments during this period that has highlighted the disparity between groups in the education system. The most disadvantaged students found this distance learning during the school closure difficult to access education during the past 2 years, particularly those who do not have the material or internet access, and also other varying factors. These students were at high risk of learning losses and also dropping out from the system temporarily or permanently. So fortunately, there has been some significant progresses in education system to address the need of disadvantaged students during the pandemic. We have seen the acceleration of digitalization in education, even in developing countries. New pedagogies were introduced in order to better prepare teachers for online learning. There were increased partnership between government and private sector to improve the education system and infrastructure to cope with the limitation of this distance learning and limited open of the school during the past 2 years. Last month in June, EEF alongside with UNESCO, UNICEF and the Ministry of Education Thailand worked together to organize the second Asia Pacific Regional Education Minister Conference to discuss priority of actions and recommendations. This series of discussion culminate into the Bangkok Statement 2022, which include priority of action comprising of first, safe school reopening, learning recovery, and continuity of learning. Second, transforming education and education system with the theme of equity, inclusion, and gender equality. However, equity does not only mean access to education, functioning literacy or basic education completion. Dr. Kirisana Pongkiratikon, advisor to the Equitable Education Fund's governing board, also addressed in the high-level segment of this conference on the importance of 6 game changer for education, which is the conclusion from the All for Education conference in 2020. The first one is the legal framework with regular and innovative budgeting system. Second, capacity building for teacher. Thirdly, area-based management and leadership at all levels. Fourth, lifelong learning. Fifth, technology and data. And sixth, partnership and alliance. In particular, this last point on partnership and alliance is essential to promote equitable education across the globe. The 2020 second Bangkok Statement recognized that there is a need for stronger collaboration between countries in order to meet this commitment and address challenge to provide equitable education and achieve SDG 4. Even though the circumstances for education are different in each country, we need to join together to address this issue. In today's session, we have 3 speakers to speak why the goal of equitable education is vital for everyone. The topic of economics, livelihood, and social impact of equitable education are particularly relevant at this moment. If we are able to better support and empower disadvantaged children, their lives and their family livelihood will be better. We can end the intergenerational cycle of poverty by investing and supporting students in their education. The path to achieve this goal are arduous and tremendous. Without further ado, I would like to welcome you all to our Equitable Education meeting. Thank you so much.
So what you've just heard is from Dr. Krayot Pattarawat, who is the Managing Director of the Equitable Education Fund in Thailand, who is the one of the co-hosts of the sessions today. And here is the session that you are looking for, and spend your time to join this very special topic on the impact of equitable choices in education. And we have 3 speakers, a very distinguished one who will reflect on their knowledge of economic, livelihood, and social, and what does it matter, or what does it do for equitable education. Let me first start with our first speaker today. The first speaker is Dr. Milan Thomas, and he's from ADB. He's an economist. He will share with us his research or studies on the topic of the economic impact. So let's hear from Dr. Milan, who is now with the ADB of the in the Department of Regional Cooperation and the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department at ADB. Dr. Milan?
Thank you. Good evening from Manila. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I'm just going to to set the stage for the other two speakers by talking about global school closures and their implications for economic inequality. So school closures are, the end is in sight. They're coming to an end after more than 2 years, but they could leave lasting human and economic damage. And of course, the learning crisis existed years before the pandemic, decades before the pandemic, but school closures, of course, did nothing to help that. According to the World Bank, 57% of children in low and middle income countries couldn't grasp a simple text by age 10, and that was in 2019. Projections now say that that's jumped to 70%. And that's because school closures caused foregone learning, by which we mean students learned less than they would have if schools had stayed physically open. And earlier this year, ADB's research department projected what the economic cost of foregone learning would be if no remedial actions were taken, bringing together several sources of data. So I'll just briefly summarize that work. So again, in April, the Asian Development Outlook, we projected the magnitude of learning losses, and the calculations are based on national length of closure, severity of closure, estimates of remote learning efficacy as relative to in-person instruction, along with data on internet access. And then we calculated the implications of those projected losses for future earnings using labor market data. And in developing Asia, the projected losses are equivalent to nearly 1 full year of schooling. And this would reduce the earning potential of youth, and specifically their projected lifetime learning or earning losses come to over $3 trillion. So that's a conservative estimate for many reasons that are explained in the Asian Development Outlook. And more importantly, we have to keep in mind that the human costs of foregone education are varied and go far beyond just pure earnings losses. So this is a graphical breakdown of the losses by subregion. And you can see that the losses are greatest in South Asia, where closures were longest. But this is really a problem that's spread all over the region. And these are average losses, but of course, this is a session about inequality in education. So we need to move past the averages. And in particular, girls and children from poor households were hit especially hard by the closures. As mentioned during the introduction video, they had lower access to distance learning during the pandemic. They have a higher tendency to be taken out of school under economic pressure, which of course was rife during the pandemic. So our projections are adjusted for those inequalities, but other disadvantages, of course, are not so easy to quantify. So nevertheless, we make our projections and show that losses are 28% higher for girls than for boys. And this is because although the differences in internet access are small in many regions, but of course, not so in some regions, the return to girls' education is higher than for boys. So the relative earnings losses from them not getting an education is larger. Projected inequality is even larger on the income dimension than on the gender dimension. Losses are 47% higher for the poorest students than for the richest students. And this is largely because students in the top quintile are 4 times more likely to have internet access than students in the bottom income quintile. So these are all projections based on data and assumptions, but more and more learning assessments based on actual test scores are becoming available from during the pandemic months. And a survey of such studies is broadly consistent with the projections. Even in advanced economies, months worth of learning were foregone, and universally poor households are hit the hardest. But thankfully, the gap between student achievement and where they would have been if schools had remained open is getting smaller with time. And promisingly for developing countries, there are impact evaluations showing that some interventions have had a mitigating effect on learning losses. But it is still worrying that over 25% of countries, only 25% of countries that were surveyed by UNICEF have concrete learning recovery plans. And that lack of planning is going to make it very difficult to close the gap for developing countries and make sure that these inequality projections that we shared don't actually become a reality. So thinking about strategies for learning recovery now, we put together a brief at ADB, and it has broad evidence-based approaches, some of which reorient what happens inside the classroom, reforms that were probably needed even before the pandemic. And it's based on a literature survey combined with discussions with global education experts. And the approaches that we identify in this brief, they all rely on two factors that are necessary for any of the recovery strategies. So first is the need for periodic student assessment. That means testing students to determine where to restart lessons, but also to keep a feedback loop between student achievement and changes in what's taught. Second is continuous teacher training. So especially where there are significant reorientation of education, where that's planned, teachers need to be reskilled accordingly. So with that, we are ready to go into the three basic reforms identified in the brief that can contribute to learning recovery. So in this diagram, there are three reform approaches in yellow boxes. These yellow boxes can be done in tandem. They can be combined with other approaches that aren't on the diagram. This is not exhaustive, but I think you'll find that the approaches here are thankfully very obvious and very common sense. Think of it as if you had a house construction project and it got delayed, but you couldn't if you couldn't adjust the deadline. You basically have three options. You can simplify the blueprint to get rid of the more fancy features of the house so that it can be built in shorter time. You can strengthen your your construction team by hiring more builders or training the ones that you already hired to build faster. You could just pay the team to work overtime so that they still finish by the deadline. Or you could do some combination of those three things. And those roughly match up with the approaches in this diagram, except of course, we're building a foundation for future livelihood, not a house. Again, the yellow boxes are reforms to recover learning. The white boxes are the specifics of how to implement the yellow boxes. And then the green boxes are enabling factors for the yellow and white boxes. So let's start, let's go from left to right. The first box on the left is consolidating the curriculum. This is about setting priorities based on what material is deemed essential, like core competencies, literacy, numeracy, and this could be decided by a committee of experts. And indeed, that's what's happening in over half of the countries surveyed by UNICEF. So that was the first box. If we move to the second box, this is targeted instruction. This is also known as teaching at the right level. And this is an approach that has strong evidence behind it in developing countries. It's also the one on this slide that has the clearest potential to bridge learning inequalities by ensuring that no learner is left behind. And there's a range of options in the targeted instruction spectrum. So on one end, you have no targeting. So this is a teacher that teaches indiscriminately to an age group, regardless of the student's individual needs. So of course, this is a problem when there are big differences in learning levels among students that are the same age. At the other end of the spectrum, you have full customization to each student's needs. So that's, fully personalized instruction, which is, of course, not very practical. Even in the richest private schools, there aren't enough resources to do that sort of instruction full time. But there are feasible and proven solutions that fall between those two extremes. So instruction can be targeted to groups. Students can be split up based on their initial level, and then they could either go to different classrooms based on that, or they could be in the same classroom, but with targeted support provided by teaching assistants. There's also targeting at the individual level, but using ed tech to make that more manageable for teachers. So computer-assisted learning can allow students to learn at their own pace. The third approach on the right is increasing hours of instruction. So that's more hours per day, longer school weeks, shorter breaks between terms, and extending hours gives students time to recover or cover for the first time even the material that they missed. So many countries are choosing to do these kinds of extensions when schools physically reopen. Of course, we need to keep in mind that for some countries, the work doesn't stop with the learning recovery plan. Even before that, they need to strategize on how to bring students who dropped out of school back into the classroom. According to the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, before the pandemic, there were over 250 million out-of-school children and youth. And we know that that number has increased. And in fact, substantially so in some countries, especially in Africa. So to complement what you would expect, the financial support, which is of course critical, public campaigns can campaigns can help to spread information about reforms that are helping dropouts reintegrate, making a return to school a more attractive option for the most vulnerable children. So just to wrap up, of course, every nation has its unique challenges and strengths when it comes to designing a learning recovery. And the combination of approaches that should be selected should be based on those. Some of the approaches that we talked about are more labor intensive, like extending school hours or hiring more teachers. That takes a lot of human resources. Others are more capital intensive, like using ed tech. So resource availability also is a key consideration. This has just been a general overview of the economic inequality implications of school closures and what might start to be done to reduce them. So we look forward to hearing from the next two speakers on first, the role of language in equitable education, and second, on how more specific demographic groups were affected by the pandemic. And these are both really essential topics that need to be taken into consideration for designing learning recovery strategies. So thank you for listening, and now it's my turn to listen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Milan, for sharing with us the perspective of your study. And I really like the part that he has the metaphor of building the house with the three options. So that is the Economist perspective. We'll come back to him during the Q&A sessions. I'd like to move on next to our next speakers, who will give us a reflection on how language have impact on equitable education. And the topic that our second speaker will share with us is why language matters for equitable quality education. And we will hear from Dr. Kirk Person. He is from SIL and based in Bangkok, based in Thailand. Dr. Kirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen now. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be with all of you tonight to talk about why language matters for equitable quality education. And I think this is very appropriate for a group that talks about equitable education, because that term actually emerged in the 1960s in the USA, related to students who did not speak English in their homes. Most of them were speaking Spanish or other languages in their homes, later Vietnamese and so forth. But the realization was that equal access to good school facilities, books, trained teachers did not equal an equitable education because these students had the added burden of having to learn in a foreign language, in a language they did not speak well when they came to school. Now, UNESCO has also been aware of this issue for many years. In 1951, they convened a meeting in Paris to discuss this and published a book that came out in 1953 that said, "We take it as axiomatic that the best medium for teaching is the mother tongue of the pupil." In other words, teachers should use a language that the children actually understand. Unfortunately, as Sheldon Schaefer, the former director of UNESCO Bangkok, said, UNESCO discovered mother tongue and then forgot about it for 50 years. In the post-war period, there is such an emphasis on using colonial languages for education or national languages in some of the newly independent countries that this whole issue of mother tongue was forgotten. This changed in 2003 when UNESCO issued a new education position paper in which UNESCO asserted its support for mother tongue instruction as a means of improving both educational quality as well as social and gender equality. Now, that was 20 years ago, and things have changed even more since then. And so I was very excited just last week to join a meeting of UNESCO that UNESCO has decided it is time to revise that position paper and issue a new document specifically looking at the role of language in meeting Sustainable Development Goal number 4, and also the UN International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which has started as of this year and will continue for the next 10 years. And one of the key points of the Global Action Plan for that decade is improving multilingual education policies and practices globally where minoritized language communities are found. And of course, that's a rather large group because there are some 7,000 languages in the world. Now, why is this all important to education? Well, even before the pandemic, we knew that 617 million children and youth would not develop basic literacy and numeracy skills. And the real tragedy of that is about 2/3 of those children were actually in school. They were in school, but not learning even the basics. And why was that? Well, for many of them, according to this World Bank report, the issue was language. Because even today, up to 40% of the global population does not have access to education in a language they speak or understand. So, for example, if all of you were sitting in this seminar and suddenly I decided to speak Finnish or Swedish and just expected that somehow, if you listened to me for enough time, you would learn those languages. Now, this shows up in other studies where the researchers consider language to be a factor. And unfortunately, they often don't. But one study that does is the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, which is done by UNICEF throughout the world. And in the case of UNICEF Thailand, they studied the issue of literacy and numeracy for children who spoke Thai in the home and children who spoke other languages, children from ethnic minority groups or migrant groups. And they found dramatic differences. For the children who speak Thai, 70 to 74% had literacy and numeracy skills, but look how that drops so dramatically for the non-Thai students. And language was actually found to be a more important factor than poverty in determining this, or whether someone lived in a rural area. So basically, we could say that in Thailand, speaking a minority languages doubles your chances that you will not learn to read or do basic math. Now, what's the solution to this? Well, we have a growing base of evidence from all over the world, both from developed countries and developing countries, that mother tongue-based education, education that includes the language that the children speak, can really make a huge difference in educational outcomes. For example, here in Thailand, we have many programs in the north of Thailand using about 7 different languages, as well as in the deep south of Thailand using the Patani Malay language. And as those programs have been in use for many years, we see dramatic differences in test scores between ethnic minority children who study in multilingual settings and those who are forced to study only in Thai. And this includes even the Thai language. The children who study in Thai-only classrooms do worse in Thai than children who study their mother tongue and then Thai as a second language. So what are the basic premises of mother tongue-based multilingual education? Well, especially for early literacy, the idea is that children need to develop their listening, speaking, and then reading and writing skills in their mother tongue first. And then once those skills are strong, they transfer them to the second language, Thai or English or whatever it is. But again, very key, they must listen before they speak and read before they write. You know, in most schools, we do it the opposite way. How are we going to teach kids English? Let's get them writing the ABCs and copying sentences from the board instead of working on the natural processes that all human beings have in their brains. And we know from evidence that if you learn to read in your mother tongue first, you learn to read other languages much better, and in fact, learn other languages much better. MTB MLE also is very structured. It's not just translating in both languages, it's deciding how different points during the school day will use different languages and develop skills very, very systematically. Now, what are the results of this? Well, in 2015, UNICEF conducted a large study of multiple countries and found that mother tongue instruction was one of the most effective ways to address school survival, meaning to reduce the dropout rate. When the children can actually understand what the teacher is saying, they're more likely to stay in school. Similarly, a report from the Learning Generation, or the International Commission on Financing Global Education Opportunity, which was chaired by the former prime ministers of the UK and New Zealand, found that mother tongue or bilingual instruction was the most financially sound investment that many countries could make. It resulted in better teaching quality, higher learning effects for a minimum amount of money. Now you look at that with other things that governments love to do, computer-assisted learning materials. Everyone loves computers. We need more computers in classrooms, but it costs a lot and the effect is actually smaller compared to mother tongue and better teaching methods and so forth. Now, of course, the COVID pandemic has made this situation even worse. Many ethnic minority children faced compound disadvantages, living in remote areas, not having internet access, not having parents who could help them with their homework because the parents were often illiterate or unable to deal with technology and so forth. So sadly, we have seen, as Milan shared in the statistics, about 70% of kids not being able to read a basic sentence. I'm sure that many of those are speakers of minority or minoritized languages. Now, everyone always asks, well, what about English? Isn't it the most important language for finance and economy? Well, it's true that English can get you a good job, but the best question is what is the best way to teach children English, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds? And now even the British Council, which makes a lot of money worldwide teaching English, acknowledges the research that having a sound foundation in the mother tongue helps children learn English better. And trying to force minoritized children to learn in English at a young age actually harms them. So again, if you want your minoritized populations to learn English well, give them a foundation in the mother tongue first. These type of messages were echoed right before the pandemic in a meeting of policymakers in Bangkok. Those policymakers issued what is called the Bangkok 'Statement' 'Statement' 'on 'Language and Inclusion', which is kind of a blueprint of how countries can step by step begin integrating minoritized languages into the curriculum. So far, 16 countries have endorsed the Bangkok Statement, and more will be invited to do so in the years ahead. So what does this mean practically? Well, just looking at a few countries in this area, Cambodia is now doing MTB MLE in 6 minority languages. In Thailand, we're doing 8. The Philippines actually is doing 65 mother tongues in education, as well as sign language. And we can't forget about sign language. And that has been done through mobilizing communities to help create curriculums from kindergarten to grade 3. And it's those programs that were still effective during the pandemic because the teachers were local people who didn't leave. Whereas in many cases, the teachers are from other places, from the city, and they all left during the pandemic. Now, we can't come to any meeting talking about equitable Ethiopia, Africa. But what about famous Finland? Every education meeting for the last 5 years, except this one, has had a professor from Finland talking about their remarkable education system. But what does Finland do about multiple languages? This is someone no one ever talks about, but actually they have very supportive policies. Over 200 Finnish schools operate bilingual programs where the mother tongue is used as the medium of instruction, and then Finnish is taught as a second language. Languages used in Finnish schools include Arabic, Somali, Russian, Vietnamese, Estonian, Sami, which is a small minority group, and Swedish, which is one of the largest minority groups in Finland. And there is legislation that if a Finnish school has even 2 students who don't speak Finnish as their mother tongue in the school, they must provide special attention for those students to develop strong abilities, hopefully in their mother tongue, if possible, and also in Finnish as a second language. So even famous Finland agrees that the language issue is key to equitable quality education. So in conclusion, I would just like to urge all of us to learn from the children, learn from the way they speak, from the way they conceptualize their world, and how to use the knowledge that they bring with them in the classroom from the languages and cultures that they live in every day to help them to learn other things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kirk. That's also, it's a very interesting perspective from the language that has impact on equitable education, particularly with the vulnerable group and the migrant children. We have heard the 2 speakers, and let me find out whether our 3rd speaker is here with us, because I learned that there's some difficulties in the technical. Dr. Sreehari?
I'm here,
Oh,
yeah.
great, wonderful. We're glad to have you back because I've learned that there are some difficulties on the technical part. So we heard from the 2 speakers, the economic perspective and then the language perspective. Now is the 3rd perspective of the theme for today is the social part, which is one of the crucial matter, particularly in the COVID context. How will the well-being of person impact or social impact on equitable education? Dr. Sreehari, he is from India and he's a psychologist who is an expert on the well-being, and he will share with us his idea or his topic on the well-being and livelihood of vulnerable young people during COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Sreehari, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have to switch off my video because my internet is not really working well, and I wish to go through the presentation quickly. I'm not sure how much time I can stay. If disconnected, I'll join back quickly. Thank you so much. So as the 2 speakers were talking about the previous speakers were talking mostly on the economic implications and the language impact. From our side, you know, we would like to bring in some of the aspects, especially looking at the equitable choices in education from the well-being perspective. That's something that we feel that it's very important, but it's not quite discussed or it's not prioritized much. So just to go through these slides. So this, like last 2 years, we were discussing about school closure, digital divide, learning gaps, and the crisis is very real. And we understood when the school reopened or when we are back to schools, the crisis is it's dramatically impacted the children a lot. It also have impacted their social and emotional well-being skills, or their well-being is also affected. And we also realized that the pandemic has also brought a lot of mental health challenges or well-being challenges, like the children going through grief. There is a lot of uncertainty, and there is fear, there is social isolation, anxiety among children, how this is actually moving, and which is also affecting the mental health of children a lot. And who is particularly impacted? The most drastically impacted group is basically the children coming from disadvantaged background. And these are basically kids from low income places, single parent families, migrant refugees. They must be coming from the ethnic minorities or children from the indigenous background, and children with special needs or special education needs, and children deprived from physical learning opportunities or socio-emotional support. Or there are kids who depend on school just for the extra meals that we get from the school system. So these are these children that we are talking about. And when we talk about well-being, these kids are when we talk about equity in education, these are the kids that, or this is the group that we are actually focusing on. We did a study, so it's always the data that help us to give insights and what we call it as the well-being gap. We took around 4 states. I've just anonymized the states in India. So it's very alarming to see that 50% of the kids, it was this study was actually carried out with 10,000 data from each state. And out of this 40,000 data that we have, around 50% of the students are either having low socio-emotional well-being, or they are coming under the low or emerging brackets of well-being, which is very alarming for us to understand. And basically post-COVID, this is something that we really have to prioritize. We even decoded. So this is a scale that we have created to measure some of the aspects of well-being. So I'm just highlighting just the overall well-being score. We also have seen, when we decode or when we in-depth analysis was done on some of the dimensions of well-being, we could also see how low the score of emotional regulations are, how the emotional well-being or personal well-being or the whole agency or self-esteem is pretty low in the group that we are looking at. So it's very important for us to actually address the well-being gap. And so when we, in the recent or the post-COVID era, something that we are all talking about is that the education is unequal. It's a K-shaped recovery that we are looking at. But what it really tells us is that there is a disconnect between the role of education and how it shapes our society. It's also enlighten us on the crisis that we are going through, where we also have to build the resiliency of our learners. And it's also very important for us to look at education from a very holistic perspective. As the previous speaker was talking about language, it's also very important when we talk about holistic education, how important it is to address the social and emotional needs, or how important it is to integrate the well-being components into the education system is very important for us to know. And what we need to do is, we need to have leapfrogging strategies. We can't wait for 100 years. We can't have minimal interventions and see how it is working. We just have to go on a leapfrogging strategies to address this crisis or the well-being gap that we are talking about. Learning should focus on the whole child, where the system that we are talking about. So I coming from India, and our insights are basically coming from the public education system. It also talks about how the school system should help children to feel that they are loved. There is a belongingness, there is well-being aspects, and there is a lot of care given to children. Fundamentally, it's like the child feels that they are listened, their emotions are validated. There is a space for them to express themselves. We also have to redefine and explain the idea of success. When we talk about equity in education, it's very important for us to redefine, or the traditional parameters of success should be something that we have to really relook and redefine. And how this can be done. A couple of points on our side, some of our insights is that we really have to broaden our measures of success. Like, it's not about getting good grades. It's not about getting a mere livelihood or a career options or a placement. It's about, like, we have to really look at the success in life in a very broader way. It's also about focusing the learner and the learning ecosystem more from a thriving, from a universal well-being perspective. It's also about strengthening the connection between the student and their family, the other ecosystem around it, the teacher, and the other players around them, even the media, or how civic leaders of the community engages or build that community resilience around the system or around the student is also very important. And we also have to, post-COVID, what we also realize is that, individually, it's very difficult for us to achieve this goal. It's all about how we collaboratively work and deal with this crisis. I wanted to give an example of one of the systemic intervention. So as a best practice, when we talk about the issue of, or the crisis of well-being, or when we also have to prioritize well-being, there is a curriculum which is running across all the government schools in India, especially in the state called Delhi. So there is 1 hour which is invested as happiness period. So there is a 45 minutes class which goes every day, where they talk about, there are different activities that the child engages with. And the idea of this is not to promote just happiness, but it's all about, making child feel important about. They also wanted to consider school as a safe space. They would like to come to school every day. And it's also a place where they are expressing their, without any fear, they are expressing themselves and they are valued in the classroom. When we talk about children coming from marginalized community, and when we actually have to attain an equitable educational choices, it's also, it is very important that they are also being validated. They are considered as part of the system, and such a curriculum. And when this curriculum is not an after school program or an additional intervention, but this is a curriculum which is existing in the system itself. And just to explore some of the objectives of the happiness curriculum, it is to promote self-awareness. It enables children to critically think, express freely and creatively, develop healthy relationship with other children, with peers, with teachers, with the other stakeholders in the community. Apply life skills to deal with conflicts, because that's something that we are also talking about. Every child should actually deal with the challenges they are facing and develop social awareness and values. To conclude, I would say, when we are talking about creating equity or excellence and well-being in the education system, 3 things have to be prioritized. 1, well-being is not something that have to be prioritized in the education system, but that should be a prerequisite itself. Like, so when school reopened, the major challenge we are seeing is like there is a disconnect between the learner. Even though we say that our program or what the education response is that the program is child centric, but still we focus more on academics. We focus on the learning loss. Are we really looking at from a lens where well-being is also something we relook, asking them how they are doing in their life, how was their past 2 years, and like that quick check-in before we move into the other activities in the academics. Creating the all invitation that I will always have is like, how we redefine success, and redefining success as thriving. Like, we should have a mission. It's that the success of the child is not really looked upon from the angle of getting good grades or being successful in the classroom or getting good grades in mathematics or getting a good placement or getting a high paid salary paid job. It's all about how the child thrive in the society and cultivating well-being for all. It's not about, when you talk about education, the child becomes the center of all the intervention, but the ecosystem that we talk about, it's very important for us to also prioritize well-being of teachers, and we also prioritize well-being of the ecosystem where the school, the other stakeholders in the school, and then teachers and the students, everybody's well-being is also prioritized. And we believe when we are able to integrate well-being and redefine success, that enable us the whole process that we are talking about, where we are able to create more equitable or equity in education is enabled. That's from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sreehari. Very interesting perspective of the happy curriculum. Due to the time that we have limit, I will take only one question to address to each speaker. Let me first start with Dr. Milan. The first question goes to Dr. Milan on, the question is, based on the diagram, can we apply contextualization for learners to understand the lessons? For example, the relation of the topic of the community and how to improve the learning. Dr. Milan?
Hi, yes, so I saw this question. This is from Justine Navalta. Thank you for the question. So, in a word, I would just say absolutely. In our consultations preparing this document, we heard anecdotally that many of the places that were best able to weather the physical school closures were those where communities were actively supporting the continued learning of children. So not just parental support, but the broader community. So your question is a great example of how the diagram isn't the full picture, and the contextualization that you're suggesting would definitely, I would see that as another enabling supporting factor, along with student assessment, along with teacher training, that would really accelerate closing the learning gaps that emerged during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Milan. If you more of you have more questions, we can send directly to Dr. Milan. The second question goes to Dr. Kirk. The question is, what can you say about some institution or teachers who implement the English-only policy?
I think it's a policy that there is no good evidence to support in most cases. Politicians love it, parents love it, everyone promises it will be great, but just look at Africa. So many countries have had English-only policies for 50 years, and most of the kids still can't read. In India, you have what Professor Mohanty has called the doom schools, which are private schools for poor children that promise to be English-only medium. And tests have shown those kids, after even 6 or 7 years in these schools, still can't read English or Hindi or their mother tongue. Sometimes the English schools work for very elite parts of society, but as a whole, they're disasters. And even the studies have shown that for most children, the average child in the average school will learn English better if they start at about age 11 after having a foundation in the mother tongue. Now, again, many people don't understand this. And one of the biggest problems we have besides politicians is helping parents, because often the parents don't recognize the value of their own language and think that their children will be further behind if they don't study in English or the national language from day one. So one of the most effective things we've found in Thailand is taking parents whose children have been in mother tongue programs and taking them to meet parents in other places that don't have them yet. I think one of the saddest stories I heard was one mother saying how her son, who studied in the mother tongue program, was reading fluently by the end of grade 1 and had to teach his brother in grade 6 how to read, because the brother had never learned how to read by being immersed in this other language. So there are many obstacles to overcome, but it's largely helping people understand. But again, I know of no good research that shows that English only actually works in the developing world. Even in the United States, it's been proven that migrant children in the United States who study in English-only programs do the worst in American schools compared to those who have some mother tongue and English as a second language first. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kirk. That has a lot to do with perception. The third question goes to Dr. Sreehari. How important is the well-being of the learners to the equitable education?
Yeah. So I think when we see, like, the diversity or the cultural diversity that we are talking about, or the background that children from the marginalized communities or disadvantaged communities coming up. So, like, they do have a lot of systemic barriers itself, like, the gender, for example. They go through the violence in the community that we are talking about. They experience a lot of adverse and traumatic experience throughout their life. And school is the only place, like, that's a place where they spend most of their time, or they consider school as a space or a safe space where they can, they feel that's a space where they can actually be. So that's where, like, it's very important for us to integrate the component of well-being, or the systemic intervention of well-being is very important, so that like, when we talk about underprivileged, and when we want to establish the equity in terms of, bringing the underprivileged into a normal, into the mainstream, well-being is a factor that will help. Like, we also know evidences that talks about the children coming from this background also go through a lot of mental health issues, and that leads to a lot of adulthood as well. So it's very important for us to integrate well-being, or try to understand well-being, the lens of well-being into the equitable education system, to address these systemic barriers and the year-long traumas and adversities that they are going through. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, all the three speakers, for the interesting sessions. I learned that we have received 10 more questions for 3 of you, but unfortunately the time, is very short. So that this is why it's our trick for the organizer, that we want you to learn more so that we can follow our sessions in the next round. But I'd like to gather all those questions, and the organizer will try to get the speaker to answer all the questions, perhaps post it on the website, or there's an email that they can reach out to you to respond to your questions. And thank you for all your interest in 3 speakers. And with the time we have, thank you for the 3 speakers who have shared with us their experience. And I hope you have learned several issues from the 3 speakers themselves. I also learned from them. And there will be key takeaway for your sessions. One of the key takeaway that I got from the 3 speakers is that you have to look at education in the ecosystem, not just as a one rigid perspective, but ecosystem of how you can help a child learn, no matter where they are, in the very farthest hard to reach or in the city. Just give them opportunity of where they can have the opportunity to be the best that they can. So those are the key message that I can get it as a takeaway from the 3 speakers. So thank you very much for 3 of you. And I hope to see you again in our next EEA sessions. So thank you very much. A big round of applause for the 3 speakers. Thank you. So I'd like to move on to the next part of the sessions for today, is that we would like to share with you why is we have this alliance, and what is the Equitable Education Alliance. And this is the 4th meeting that the Alliance has organized. I have one of the key player, a person who can tell you of how this alliance comes about. Dr. Thantida Wongprasong, who is the director of the Innovation for Learning Opportunity at EEF, or the Equitable Education Fund in Thailand, who is a part of the initiator of this alliance, will tell you what is all about this alliance. Dr. Thantida?
Thank you, Dr. Tinsiri. A very good morning, a very good evening to all of you. I'm delighted to be here along with friends and colleagues from the UNESCO, ADB, SIL, and Dream a Dream. So it had been an exciting session, And it was also inspiring to see our chain maker, I think, zooming in from Manila, India, and Bangkok to discuss new and creative way to drive and sustain equitable change. We recognize that there's a lot to learn and a lot to do about equitable education. And we need stronger collaboration and commitment to pursue education, equitable education. So under situation that we are facing today, as the three panelists has presented. So let me introduce you the network that might be interest of you. With support of UNESCO Bangkok, the Equitable Education Alliance, or EEA, was created in 2020. The Equitable Education Alliance, or EEA, hopes to, I think, contribute to build a community of practice of similar-minded organizations in order to advance the work of equitable education, which will lead to achieve the SDG 4. I think, as you know, the practical implementation of equitable education policy remains challenges in many countries. And along with the Alliance, EEF, UNESCO, UNICEF, CMO, Save the Children have also organized the Equitable Education Conference for the past 2 years to further disseminate knowledge on equitable education and its implementation in pursuit of SDG 4. So since launch, organizations from 11 countries and 6 international organizations have participated in our previous meeting. Participants are, for example, from UNESCO, GPE, OECD, Ministry of Education from various countries, New Zealand, Finland, Malaysia, Canada, and also public and research organizations also have been participated. So let me show you what the Alliance, what are the function and objective of the Alliance. I think firstly, the Alliance will try to, based on discussion today on the impact of equitable education, we hope to continue to create and disseminate knowledge on equitable education. So partner and public can learn together and advocate for equitable education policies in their own countries or at regional or globally as well. So secondly, in addition to knowledge sharing, the Alliance also would like to support institutional capacity of organization in implementing equity-based education. So the capacity building will not only technical support, but also financing model. We have found that so many countries and our partner have very interesting financing models, that can how to implement, how to mobilize resources in order to actually to work on equitable education as well. And also there will be tools and instruments to measure and monitoring progress as well. Lastly, the EEA also will be a platform that connect and collaborate with partner, which include government agency, NGO, and private sector to mobilize expertise for equitable education initiative. We hope that organization and institution who are committed to equitable education will have opportunity to exchange knowledge and best practices and also seek technical support to further their goals and initiative as well. So we look forward to growing our network of similar-minded organizations. So if your organization have a goal to achieve equitable education in your countries, so please feel free to scan the QR code and visit our website for information and activities. So last but not least, I think that with the educational inequality that we are facing today, as the panelist has presented, I think this is an opportunity, I think, for us as I think we all, I consider all of you are champions or change makers in your own country, to drive these changes for the system in order to deliver more equitable and a good quality education. So I think in order to achieve that, we also need, all of you as a network and work together. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thantida, for telling us why we have this Equitable Education Alliance from the very first place. And it makes it worthwhile for all of you to join us to see how we have a same mind or a great mind who think alike come together to be as part of the community of practices. And we want to be a platform where we can learn from each other, where we can share our experience and knowledge, because we all experience the similar frustration, similar problems, but by coming together, we can help each other solve our problems. And that is why it mattered, particularly in the context of COVID, where things can be very frustrated in many organizations and many schools, particularly in reaching out to the unreached students. So that is from what Dr. Thantida trying to get you all to take part and join the Alliance. Thank you very much, Dr. Thantida. And I hope you and UNESCO team will organize more interesting sessions like this more and more in the future, and we will have more Alliance coming to join us. Okay. So on the last part, before we close tonight, I would like to have invite Dr. Krayot Patharawat to have a closing note for tonight.
I would like to express my appreciation for all the panelists and moderators for their contribution to today's session. In the past hour, we have discussed key themes on how achieving equity in education plays a critical role in the society. We hope that with today's session, everyone recognizes that society needs equitable education, that every student has an opportunity to access quality education. Although the pandemic is not fully over yet, we must ensure that students continue to learn and that learning recovery is achieved for all. According to the UIS, prior to the pandemic in 2018, there are over 258 million of students from primary and upper secondary were out of school, or about 1/6 of the global population in this age group. It is not difficult to imagine that the number of out-of-school students have increased since the pandemic. We should pursue policies that transform and build education system to do more flexible for all students and resilient against all crises. Not only will this transformation of the education system bring children back to school safely, it will also help them recover from learning and social-emotional losses in the past 3 years sustainably. The goal of achieving education for all is the purpose of our Equitable Education Alliance. We need all for education to achieve this education for all. We need to advocate equity in our education system through effective legal framework, financial mechanism, and policy implementation, as well as monitoring evaluation system. However, and more importantly, we need to come together to accomplish this goal. The Equitable Education Alliance expressed the vision and strategy of partners to achieve this goal of equitable education, all with their set of advantages and competencies. To have education for all, we need all for education, and this is more urgent than ever before. As Ms. Thantida has kindly introduced you to the Equitable Education Alliance, and I would like to invite everyone here to attend the 2022 All for Education Conference, which will be organized on October 19 and 20 by the EEF, UNESCO, UNICEF, SIMEO, and Save the Children. The conference will be based on the second priority of action from Bangkok Statement 2022. The two key objectives of this conference. First, how do we further transform the education system to safeguard children from any future crisis, and how to ensure that they can grow and thrive in the future. And the second objective is to explore how do we tackle key areas such as learning recovery or out-of-school children. We will keep you updated as the event approaches. Please stick with us through our channel of communication. Once again, I would like to thank everyone who attended today's meeting, and I hope that this meeting can convey to you that although arduous, we can transform education system around the world that can reach out to every single student and transforming their life for the better. Finally, I would like to thank UNESCO Bangkok and UNICEF Thailand for their contribution and support for this event. I hope you enjoy and have a good day and have a good week. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much for your time tonight in spending with us, attending this fourth meeting of Equitable Education Alliance on the theme of economic livelihood and social impact of equitable education. And I hope you take some food for thought with you tonight and We hope to meet you again in the 5th meeting of the Equitable Education Alliance. So good night from Bangkok. I'm Sreehari Ravindranath from UNICEF Thailand. สวัสดีค่ะ